Я попрошу участников форума.
I kindly ask the participants of the forum to take their places, take their seats, because we continue. Thank you. Our next block of discussions is called Special Opinion. Some background, how we came up with this idea. First, we invited a lot of foreign guests that possess unique experience, but later we came to understand that not all of that experience will be suitable for all those 5 sessions that we prepared for you throughout the forum. Though we believe that it will be illegal to conceal those unique experiences and those unique knowledge that such people can offer. Due to that, we have decided to organize a separate session called Special Opinion. Each presentation will take 20 minutes, and after that, the same time will be given for discussion to that person, and there will be only one soloist on stage. And now I'd like to invite here on stage, and this person has already taken part in the opening ceremony of our forum. Unfortunately, during that time, we didn't have time to tell you that Marek Bartelik, the Doctor of Arts, just a month ago got a new position, got promoted to a new position. Previously, he was the president of the Art Critics Association in the United States of America. Now he was appointed the new president of the International Association of Art Critics. And it was with great efforts that we restrained him from talking on this topic at other conferences and venues he took part in a number of months. For us, it's a great pleasure that Mr. Bartelik's program will premiere today in Russia about his vision, how this association will develop. Mr. Bartelik, please, the word is yours.
I feel like a superstar here, so especially with the music. Yes. Anyway, I guess I'm going to improvise a little bit. It is a wonderful honor to be elected president of AIFAAR International. So I have been thinking a lot what to do for the organization. It's, as I mentioned this morning, it's an old organization, or relatively old. It was established in 1948-49 by UNESCO. The main office is in Paris, but we have 63 chapters around the world. The US section is the biggest one. We have about 500 members in the United States. I don't know how many are in Russia. I hope there will be more and more. It would be lovely to do something with you in the future. As I said, our next Congress will be in Zurich in 2012, in July, and then we are going to Documenta for a post-Congress event. One thing which I wanted to discuss with you and perhaps hear from you how you feel about this, it's interesting. I've been listening to the conversation this morning, and it's fascinating. Actually, it's really very interesting. One thing, I will go back to that issue of political correctness because I find it fascinating too. And my take on it is that when we say political correctness, I guess in the US, I would say, and then versus Russia, perhaps the stressing word here, it's political, versus in the US, which is correctness, and that changes quite a lot because I don't even understand exactly what it means here, but the political aspect to me seems to be very important for you in Russia versus how we interpret that word. And speaking about universality, for example, and equality, which was mentioned several times, I guess without the way how we understand political correctness, there won't be equality and universality. So those issues are a little bit confusing, but on the other hand, they are very interesting for me to think about, how those terms can be interpreted. As a new president of AIFAAR International, what I want to focus on, it's not as much on the marketing aspect or commercial aspect of art and art criticism, but rather on the profession itself. And what interests me the most is the question of how we can redefine our profession as something which is connected to contemporary context and contemporary identities. So for me, one of the points that I would like to discuss with my colleagues within the organization is the question of the language itself. And I mean language as a form of communication which has its kind of material qualities. In other words, I think one of the problems which we have with new media, with a lot of people blogging now and so on, that the language itself becomes more and more loose. So the language becomes less rigorous. And several critics have been mentioned this morning, like people like Baudelaire and, Diderot, and also we could add Verlaine and so on. And I think one thing which distinguishes them, apart from their ideas, is the fact that they wrote in a beautiful prose. So I think that's what nowadays it's a little bit perhaps, as I said, not as rigorous as it was in the past, at least in a general sense. I know that there are wonderful critics who write in beautiful prose, but that's one aspect that I think is central to my idea about what art criticism should be and how we should sort of reclaim our place in the conversation. I think the other thing, for a long time, I believe critics and artists were considered not enemies, but on the others, sort of like in conversation which could be not necessarily, friendly, or it was a little bit adversarial. So now it seems to me like critics and artists are on the same side of the equation, on the same side of the issue. Mainly, there is another species, quote unquote, which is a curator. Curators and gallerists are in the position of power. Artists and critics are not necessarily. So I think in some way we are in the same place and speak from the same position, therefore we can reinforce each other. So my agenda is also to bring artists and critics as close together as possible and create a conversation which is meaningful and leads to maybe to some new developments. The other thing that as the president of the International Association, I think about different places and how different places contribute to art criticism. So for a long time, the way how we channeled our ideas, it was in a sense that we would go from any place that, let's call it periphery, and then we would end up going to the center, because the center in some way validated the peripheries. It kind of created a right context for people from, let's say, Russia or Brazil or Korea to have a dialogue with the world. So my idea is to create a different way of conversing. It's more like periphery to periphery. And I think it could be interesting, for example, having a conversation between Russian critics or Russian artists and critics in Brazil, rather than going to New York or Berlin or Paris. I mean, those places are still there and they are very important, but there is another way of distributing sort of attention, which I think periphery to periphery can be a very interesting proposition, perhaps. And since the organization has 64 chapters and maybe 3 centers and 61 peripheries, the idea of including peripheries in the conversation is very important. Well, there's also the question of AIFAAR is an organization with long tradition and not necessarily the most visible, particularly among young people. So the idea is also, well, the question or the problem is how to attract young people, and there are many young people, I guess, in the audience. I don't know if you practice criticism or you are mostly artists or how you are involved with the arts. But anyway, what I would like to hear from you, since it's a conversation, would be how do you see a role of an organization like ours, AIFAAR, an organization of critics, relevant to your experience? Because in some way, this is where the future is going to be. And I guess, as the speakers who spoke here before mentioned, the future has to be prepared now. So young people in some way will determine what will be the future of art criticism. So therefore the question for me is, and the question which I ask now as I travel around the world, it's like, what makes young people interested in art criticism, and what kind of art criticism they are interested in, and also how an organization like ours, AIFAAR, can actually contribute to your growth as intellectuals, as critics, and so on. So, so those are some of the central aspects of the program that I presented when I was elected president in Asunción in Paraguay. And I would love to hear, well, your reaction to what I just said, perhaps.
Так, напоминаю, наши волонтеры.
I remind you that our volunteers are carrying 5 mics with them. They're in the audience, but for the first question, I would have to be the one who gives the mic to the speaker. Nina Getelashvili, professor. I would like to ask to our distinguished speaker the following question. How many young critics are there in AIFAAR? And what is the age limitation, or what is the average age of the members of the International Association of Art Criticism?
I don't know. I know the statistics of the US section because that's what I've been running for last, well, 3 years as a president, and before I was a co-president. So if we have 500 members, I believe maybe 15% are people under 30, which is not much, right? We are hoping there will be more. I mean, there are some requirements how to become a member, and that's maybe what creates some problems for younger critics, because different countries have different ways of selecting critics to, as members. In our section, we require that a critic has 3-year experience in writing, and it has to be about contemporary, well, 20th and 21st century art. So, and it has to be critical. It cannot be just a sort of form of journalism. All that said, well, now it's a little bit different because there are so many people who blog. So we never accepted, well, 10 years ago there were no bloggers in the organization. Now we allow people who blog to become members, and that's a new way of, I guess, recruiting more people, because for younger people, I believe it's very difficult to publish in newspapers. I'm very lucky. I've been publishing with Art Forum for 20 years, and I know that it's kind of a privilege. But for people who are much younger, well, it's more complicated to find those places because they are disappearing also. Art Forum is one of those, I guess, magazines that survive, but many other have very short period of life. So in other countries, I believe it used to be, and I don't know how it is in Russia, but it used to be that you had to be recommended by 2 members who are already members of AIFAAR, and that's a little bit problematic because it's, it's like if you have you have to find those two friends who will recommend you. Otherwise, you have no access to the organization. So that has to be probably changed. But yeah.
And an immediate reaction by Nina. I want to explain that this does not only happen in the American chapter, this is the approach in every chapter of the professional hermeneutic approach is applied everywhere because we need experienced critics as members. Still, I want to ask this question, irrespective to the membership issue. Do you think that generations have their own views and the people who are 20 are different from those who are 30 and from those who are 40? And I'm monitoring the situation in America, although this is very painful for America, and the critics who are now 50 and 60, they actually fought in the war because the contemporary art is the art of the recent 20 years. Because when we developed the agenda, I suggested I suggested to take only the 20 years. Do you observe any difference in artistic outlooks or outlooks on the art between the young, the critical young, and are they really critical? Can they observe what is happening?
Well, it's a big question, but I mean, people are definitely taller, so that's for sure. But in terms of the way how they think, I think young critics perhaps feel more pressure to be successful than people felt, let's say, 20 or 30 years ago. At least I see with my students. I teach at Cooper Union in New York, and I teach at MIT in Boston. And I think there is more pressure to succeed right away. And it also concerns, I guess, artists too, because there is that emphasis on youth that if you don't succeed right away, it's difficult. So that pressure, it's not necessarily good. What's good that the generations of young critics understand contemporary art perhaps better than anybody else. I mean, I feel that the kind of art that I really was passionate about was the art of the late 80s and early 90s. This was my period when I was going everywhere and seeing everything. Now, I don't feel the same passion. Intellectually, I can connect, but it's not the same experience. So if you want to bring passion to your reception of art, actually being of that generation is crucial. I teach. One of the reasons why I teach also because I want to absorb that passion from young people and learn from them. One of the things that I learned, for example, which I found incredibly interesting, it's the question of how space can be represented in painting. And it's when you are a skateboarder, the way how you run through space is very different than how you experience space than when you walk or you run, right? So the idea that space can be also identified differently in art in relationship to the kind of things that you use to move, like roller skates or roller blades or, skateboards and all those things. It's actually quite interesting. So I would never figure it out on my own, but it was one of the students who said, when I'm on a skateboard, the way how I experience space is completely different. So I would say those are sort of precious things, I was listening and I was thinking, as the president of this organization, I have to be optimistic. So I'm optimistic, it's like, I guess that's my role, right? So, But the optimism comes also from listening to people like that student of mine and revealing things that I had no idea about. So that's where I say, it's different, but at the same time, it's also very interesting because it brings a lot of new thought to the way how we understand, art and what happens within that frame, which is defined as art, I guess.
У меня будет вопрос к залу.
I have a question to the audience. No, the question will wait. Yelena Orlova. A question from the audience. Good afternoon. I'm an art critic. My name is Yelena Orlova. What are the privileges of the members of your union apart from free tickets to certain European and American museums? So why do you need to be a member? To have a nice pension later? I would like to find it out. What is the sense of that organization from the standpoint of practical needs of a critic?
Well, you're absolutely right. One of the reasons why people, at least in the past, joined AIFAAR was because it gives you this card and you can go to major museums. Not in Russia, unfortunately. I don't know why, but in France, in the US, it gives you access to any museum, and so. To answer your question, I think on a more, on less practical and more kind of idealistic level, I think that in the present time, the way how we exist in this so-called art world can be very lonely. This is a big group here, but we often think about ourselves as being different and sort of outside, It's like you go to that opening and you look, everybody's talking to somebody and you just stand by yourself and say, I have to leave because, I have nobody to talk to, and how long can I stay with that glass of wine and pretend that I'm, kind of happy the way how I am, right? So the organization, for me, and I hope it's for everybody else, creates a sense of community, a sense of it can be professional, but it can be a little bit more. It can be almost like a sense of being with people who care about the same things. And I think nowadays it's very precious. On a more practical side, AIFAAR, at least, in the US, but also internationally now, we try to organize as many events as possible, so all kinds of conferences where we discuss different issues in a broader sense, but also in a more narrow sense. There will be a session. We have a panel in Abidjan, in Ivory Coast, in a few weeks, and next year I want to do a panel about women in arts in the Middle East and in countries like Pakistan and India and so on. So we try to bring people as much as possible to this conversation from different parts of the world and sort of create a context which, as I said, makes us very, very, together. So there is the practical side, and there is also the side of more humane side, which is, that we all need to be included. And I think one of the greatest joys for me, apart from, my ego, is that in some way being elected in the United States and in the world kind of as the international president, it sort of gives me a sense of being accepted. And I think that's a wonderful sort of feeling, that you are sharing your experience with other people who think like you and who understand, that things can be changed. So, thank you.
Thanks a lot. I have a question to the audience. Which of you is a member of AIFAAR?
Господин Bartelik мог посчитать ему это.
I'll make a pause. But I ask this question for a reason.
You meant, yeah. Well, I'm happy to take the blame for it. I unfortunately,
Satisfaction.
fortunately, I maybe like everybody else. I was just elected a month ago, so we have done a lot of things in the U.S. I think we have a wonderful organization. One thing which we do, we give awards for the best exhibitions of the year in 12 categories. And it became a major event where artists and critics get together, and we kind of celebrate, this togetherness. So perhaps in Russia you need to do the same thing. Internationally, I really want people from everywhere to be included, and we miss the Russians. Nobody comes to our meetings as far as I remember, for last 4 or 5 years. So it would be wonderful to see people coming from here and participating. As I said, we will have a great congress in Zurich, I think, and then we are going to Documenta, and next year it will be perhaps Canada and I don't know yet, and then Korea. So I can only hope that that you will join.
Позвольте себе, да, сказать.
Well, something seems to be wrong between us and ICA. Because I've been in ICA for 20 years, but for some reason we never saw people going to receptions and banquets and those celebrations, but we haven't noticed much community forming activity. It's like a picnic. So you have all the opportunities.
My first move, I came here, and I'm very happy to be here. So I hope it will develop into a relationship. So, yeah.
Александр Давыдович вновь к нам присоединился.
Alexander is joining us, and the forum has been revived. I asked my first question for a reason about the number of members in the room. I will ask 2 questions. Who has an professional artistic background? About 1/2 of you. Don't lower your hands. And which of you has published anything in any media during the last month? Yeah. Not only professionals. Okay. What I hint at, I'm drawing closer to our next session, which is entitled The Problems of Artistic Education. Actually, have you any more questions to the presenter? Mr. Bartelik.
And that you will join. I don't want to suggest, but there is an open section, which is not a national section, and you can become member of the open section if you don't want to be a member of the Russian section. But it would be wonderful to have a big Russian section with all. I hear myself speaking and sort of preaching about membership and so on. It's not necessarily what constitutes the essence of my interaction as a critic, but I think it's a great opportunity just to tell you, please do something, because if you don't do anything, nobody's going to do for you, right? And yeah. So I always tell my students, at one point I started preaching, and then it's time to stop, I guess.
Спасибо вам большое.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I have a question? Another question? Yes, certainly. I'm a journalist from the Nevskoye Vremya newspaper, Yelena Dobrikova. I'm interested how much artistic critics in the US understand the work of a painter. Maybe the critics were in artists before, and is there a link between the two professions?
Well, as I said, one of the links is that in some way, to exercise both professions. Well, we heard about art market and everything, which for me it's the least interesting aspect of the conversation, but that's my personal sort of take. As I said, I'm more interested in the profession as a kind of way of philosophizing about the world. So in that sense, I think the critic and the artist are very close, because if you want to focus on the economic side, I guess for most of the cases you are just gambling with something which is completely unpredictable and perhaps will not happen. But if you think about either of those professions or creative kind of processes as a way of experiencing life and understanding what's happening, it's a lifetime kind of experience. So in that respect, I think because they are so removed from any kind of rationality of sort of economic rationality, despite the fact that we hear about those huge prices, most of the artists don't make any money and most of the critics don't make any money. But on the other hand, it can be a wonderful way of living. My first profession was actually a bridge engineer. So I studied civil engineering, and at the age of 30, I said, it's time to change my life because I didn't like it. So I was making a lot of money, or enough money, and worked for a firm downtown New York, and so I went back to school and became art historian, and it took a long time to get my PhD. But in some way, I feel that this was probably the best thing that I did in my life. This was when I was turning 30. I know you just turned 30, right? So. So it's if there is a moment in life when you can do, and there are no good moments or bad moments. I mean, for me it was 30, and then now when I look back, I make less money, but on the other hand, my life is much more exciting. So in that way, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but the fact that you can derive meaning from encounters with other people, from conversations, from intellectual kind of discourse, it's probably the most satisfying thing in life, and that's maybe where the two can coexist as partners rather than being kind of in a relationship that one has to validate the other. The question, I mean, the whole notion of criticism is actually very interesting, because in some way criticism is not different from any kind of writing, because for me, writing is already engaged in critical thought. So whether you write art criticism or you write fiction or you write poetry, in a way it's very close to each other. So that's why maybe the question of language is so important for me, that I feel that the language is something that gives you a sense of accomplishment. The way how you phrase, the way how you choose words, the way how you create a syntax, the way how you, sort of manipulate your material. So in that way, I would say again that art and criticism are very, very close to each other. And because of the sort of critics become, as I said before, curators and gallerists are the most powerful people perhaps in the art world. Critics are not powerful anymore. Our voice kind of has certain power, but it's not as essential. So in some way it creates a fantastic situation to relax, not to feel that you have this huge responsibility towards somebody else, but you can focus on your own responsibility towards your own kind of profession and your own, sort of your own text in a way.
Who else wants to ask question to Mr. Bart? Yes. Florence Stand.
Florence, start.
I wanted to ask a question about one of the remarks you made about the difference between the curator and the gallerist are the ones who have power,
Right.
and the artist and the critic on the other side having
Yes.
less power.
Right.
And you were also asking what the young generation is expecting from, the AIFAAR. And
Right.
I'm a young art writer and a curator, and 70% of the art critics that I know in Paris
Right.
or in London, they're also curators.
Right.
And they are very close to artists
Yes.
too.
Yes, it's true.
So I'm just wondering how maybe that would be kind of a nice thinking ground between curators, critics, and the AIFAAR to kind of rethink those differences, maybe. I
Right.
don't know.
No, you're absolutely right. And when I made this distinction, maybe it wasn't precise enough because I'm aware, I myself, I have curated a number of exhibitions. So, and I know that for younger people to have a professional life, you have to bridge those things. So people curate, they write, and but I think I still think that those are two different ways of using your creative power. And personally, I think writing is something which gives me much more satisfaction than organizing exhibitions. So it's true that to attract younger people, we have to be more flexible. Like in our section, in the US section, we accepted people who have blogs, so bloggers, if you have a blog which is substantial and so on, and I guess we'll hear about blogs tomorrow, right? So, and same with curators / critics, and we have some artists in our association too, and it's, you can be a writer and you can be a critic, right? There is a long tradition, I don't know how it is in Russia, but in the US there is a long tradition going to people like Harold Rosenberg, who was mentioned this morning, and a lot of, Robert Smithson wrote wonderful criticism and so on. So there is a whole model that could be, related to. So yes, I think the point that you made, it's an important point. And nowadays, with your generation, you have to kind of be more resourceful in a way that you cannot just rely on writing for one newspaper or one magazine, because first of all, they don't pay very well, I mean, in the US, I think...
Or they don't pay anything.
Yeah. Yeah, I know the pain, and at one point you just figure out how to live differently, but if you love it, you will do it. I only write when I travel. That was another aspect of, we talk about art criticism as something, as a model that has boundaries. In a way, you have to create boundaries for yourself. As I said, I've been writing only when I go abroad, because I like to be in a situation when I don't know anything about what's happening. So I was asked to look for exhibitions in St. Petersburg. Yesterday I spent the whole afternoon going to number of galleries and seeing things that I didn't anticipate, I didn't know anything about, and hopefully I can write something from St. Petersburg. But this is a way how I dealt with the system, how I thought I would work within the system, which has art magazines, galleries, collectors, and so on, and where you inject your presence as a person who wants to be relevant, but on the other hand, you don't want to be completely at the mercy of the system, So there are, those are things that you have to learn on your own, and now, as I said, you have blogs, so you can be more independent, but on the other hand, you also want to participate in the system, because the system also has good things, and I'm very happy that I write for Art Forum, and I've done it for 20 years, and I just figure out what suits me, and that's what I guess all of you have to do individually.
Да, у нас есть вопрос в левом крыле зала.
We have a question in the left wing. Irina Reshetnikova, tell me please, do you monitor somehow the scientific work of your association? Yes, you provide certain privileges to the members of your associations, and when they are already members, how active are they, and what is their contribution to the general process? Не знаю.
Oh yeah. Well, we try to encourage people. It's very interesting, your question, because in the US we've been just discussing things. ICA USA, we have a big program with a lot of things going on. But when you go to the internet, you don't find many things actually, because the knowledge is not digitized, I guess. And so we try to encourage people to do some kind of research, and maybe somebody will write a PhD dissertation about history of ICA USA. Internationally, there are a number of books that we have published which deal with the history of the organization. So we are trying to make sure that that kind of history doesn't get lost. And you know, as we progress now, I think we have more tools and also more money to support that kind of research. There is a wonderful organization in Rennes in France, which is the Archives of Criticism. It was created a few years ago, and that's where you know, a lot of archives go nowadays. So that probably will become one of those centers where you would like to go if you are interested in history of art criticism, and people like, let's say, Pierre Rastani or people like that, you know, who were major figures and left their archives for that kind of institutions. So we are trying to preserve this knowledge as we kind of create new venues for the future critics. I hope it answered your question, because I didn't hear it very well, so yeah.
I have only one question. Мне бы
Только
хотелось
I'd like to get to know what book was read by Mr. Butov in the last half an hour sitting in this room. Dmitry, maybe you'll answer us. What book were you reading for the last half an hour? Can you please give him the mic? Maybe you were reading something about art criticism. This book here is called The Secrets of Russian SWAT, Special Forces, How to Train Military Men. You see, for an artist, it's really hard to listen the talks about art criticism. The Russian environment is such that art criticism and the world of art have no points of connection. The criticism have nothing to do with the market and no influence whatsoever. If they write, if they don't write about you, it doesn't really matter. For me, I was just interested in finding out who benefits from this industry, why it exists in here, apart from the editors-in-chief of different magazines. I know some magazines that might exist on sponsors' money, which no one sees apart from sponsors themselves. It's a very mythical sphere, this art criticism, and I really wanted to know about it in a more practical way. Dmitry, can you answer yet one more question? Maybe you and Mr. Bartelik could answer it both. Those who don't know, Mr. Gotov last month has successfully held an exhibition in the State Russian Museum, which was organized by the Department of Newest Trends, represented by Alexander Borovsky and Alessia Turskaya. Today, the same exhibition opened in Moscow, but the question is as follows. curators, journalists, art historians, representatives of professional educational establishments were heard in this room, in this forum, but we haven't heard the artists. What are the artists ashamed of, or what are the artists afraid of? We have about 20 artists in here in this room, at least those artists who are participating in different exhibitions and do that quite often. Maybe why are you not interested in asking any professional questions to an art critic, to a president of a professional association? Well, imagine I'm in New York, and I won't call you the name of the most fashionable curator. Imagine that he works with a young artist. He develops him, he makes an exhibition, he tells everyone what a genius you are. The next day, a New York Times critic writes an article that this is not an exhibition, it's crap, and that artist is a phony. And the next day, this curator, he cancels the whole exhibition and stops working with this artist. So in those conditions like that, the dialogues that we're doing right now can be viewed from a different angle. In Russian conditions, I think this is even not possible. Do you believe that the Western situation is a mirror of a successfully developed art world or a successfully functioning criticism? Well, imagine that somebody is doing an exhibition, a large biennale in Venice, and he's participating in it. And then you can trace how successful the person is by the number of responses he's managed to obtain from critics. A person may be very successful, he may organize an amazing event, but he might not be mentioned in a single magazine or a single newspaper. In any case, criticism is an underdeveloped art history. In art history, we have methodology, we have science. In art criticism, we're dealing with God knows what. We deal with subjective opinions which are not justified by anything. We deal with short essays, and in those conditions, it's like in the book I'm reading about Russian SWAT. You can only fight if you see an enemy in front of you, an adversary, and your blow is not targeted into an empty space. When you are hitting something ephemeral, you are just wasting your energy. I'm finished. Thank you.
Господин Bartelik.
Well, but that's precisely what I think I try to argue, that, you know, that time when critics and artists were some kind of adversarial towards each other, I think it's over. You know, critics do not have that power. You mentioned the New York Times that, you know, that the exhibition closes down next day. It doesn't happen anymore.
You've never heard about this event?
Well, I will tell you another situation. You know, Maurizio Catalan's show was mentioned here, right? And he has a show at the Guggenheim right now.
Yeah.
Peter Sheldo, who is one of the main critics writing for The New Yorker, wrote a review, and he stated something like this, because Maurizio Catalan says, after this exhibition, I'm not going to make more art, right? And Peter Sheldo says, well, it's very interesting, but perhaps he never made any art, you know, so that didn't close down the Guggenheim, you know, he's still Maurizio Catalan, right? And people will organize exhibitions for him. So, yes, there were cases in the past, I know. It's more and more difficult, even for people like Roberta Smith or Jerry Saltz, you know, to impact so much, you know, the galleries that they will, or the museums that they will get rid of the show. So going back to the point that I made before, so maybe this is the time when the two weak can get together and create kind of less weakness from the partnership rather than, you know, looking at each other with suspicion. I also think, you know, there are two kinds of artists. There is one that there are artists who look at critics as writers. You know, when you write catalog essays, you know, it's a conversation basically between two intelligent people who have, or creative people who have things to say. And there are other kinds of artists who look at your name and, you know, never read what you wrote, and, you know, and they just want to see if this was, everything is correct, and, you know, in terms of how many times you praise them, right? And that's the thing. So I'm not interested in those kind of artists, like you are not interested in critics who write just whatever they want to write, right? So I think, you know, it's the question of finding the right conversation with the right person. It's not the adversarial relationship between those two kind of groups of people, because there are artists and there are critics, and there are good critics and bad critics. So that would be my answer. And as I said, because artists have less power, because the gallerists and the curators, I will still insist, they are very powerful, you know, or collectors, right? Critics, you know, when I go to an opening and I say I'm a critic, it doesn't impress people that much, you know, which is good, because then I can be myself. I don't have to kind of say, okay, you know, I don't have time. So the situation, I think the situation of weakness, quote unquote, actually it's a good situation. You know, it's a kind of the power of the weak. It's like being silent sometimes says more than when you are constantly verbal and you have to speak, you know, which
Thank
I
you.
guess says maybe
Thank you so much.
it's time to get silent
Слово
for me too. Yeah.
Слово снова предоставляю.
Now, the floor is given back to Alexander Borovsky, who has initiated this conversation. It happened without me, so you tried to withdraw yourself from this discussion. Yes, but the discussion was good. I really like this division between the artists who treat critics as their partners, as a person with whom they can communicate, and those artists who treat critics as a power or an adversary or something. When I read the works in the 20s of the last century, in the 60s of the last century, I see why criticism was needed at that particular time. But in our times, well, in the end of the 80s, a whole group of artists appeared. They were quite good. They could write about themselves, at least certain statements. And it happened so that this group of artists became self-satisfactory. They have become fully self-dependent. Or they can be a different option when Roberta Smith comes and says these are good artists. But such groups of people, they need curators. That is why I try to be on friendly terms with the international and Western curators, because it contributes to a career, it helps you to get into a different exhibition. It's a fully legal way to follow. No one can argue that an artist needs a career. The artist needs all those ticks as opposed to the lines of different exhibitions, because this is a recognition. Recognition from Western galleries, Western museums is a market thing. But to me, I would like more an artist who reads not only his own works and the works and criticism of his friends on the internet, but who tries to treat a text as a dialogue that is his main objective is to develop the culture, or even to develop the spectator.
Here, right? In a way, it is a partnership, and I think when it works, it's beautiful, and it goes back to my original point that we all need a community. And the way how you define your community, you know, it can be a group of your friends who are all artists, it could be critics, it could be writers, it could be poets, but in a way, I think it's very essential to our being. And also on a practical level, I mean, if you create a context for you, young people, you know, you have your own spaces where you show your work, perhaps you have more chance to become successful than if you are just alone for hoping for being discovered. So yeah, I think, you know, all I can say, as I said, I represent an organization, but I also want to speak as an individual. That's what worked for me, you know. I feel like I'm a very lucky man, you know. I really, what I do gives me a great joy, so I think it's good to realize that kind of road makes sense, you know. You can, you know, you make less money, but you meet wonderful people, you have conversations like this. You know, when I was an engineer, it's 5 o'clock, you would go home and, you know, you had a summer house and, you know, it was there was no conversation. Now I cannot stop talking because I love it.
Thank
Okay, thank you.
you.